Okay, Louise, off you go.
Hi, I'm Dr Louise Phillips. I'm a GP from Brisbane, Australia, and I am subspecialised in low carb medicine whilst also working as a mainstream GP. And my passion is teaching other health professionals and other doctors about low carb medicine. And I've developed an online learning platform called Low Carb Scripts, which is designed to make it as easy as possible for health professionals to pick up this knowledge and also implement it in very time efficient ways with patients in standard consultation time.
That's great. So you've got a whole bunch of people here tonight who are probably interested in either starting low carb, they're doing low carb, they've got problems doing low carb. So I'll kick the ball off with a couple of questions that came in. We do have one in the chat, which I'll share with you as well. So I had a question from Joe.
Mm-hmm.
So Joe's been doing low carb for a while, 4 years, and is starting to get heart palpitations and shortness of breath with exercise.
Right. I will also just start off by saying that what I'm providing is general information. It's not specific medical advice. And the symptom that I would suggest that describes is shortness of breath on exertion, which can indicate cardiac problems or...
Hang on, lost you. You've gone on mute for some reason.
That's weird. How much of that was heard? Was any of that heard?
I heard you say you're just giving general medical advice, and it may indicate some cardiac problems. So
yes,
that's as I got to. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, and not knowing your particular situation, people may come into looking at low carbohydrate diets from varied health positions, and a lot of times in a condition like, for instance, if there was diabetes was at present, for instance, then about 25% of the complications of diabetes can start in the pre-diabetes phase. So you can still be at increased cardiovascular risk just because of pre-existing conditions. So I would suggest that if you're having increasing breathlessness with exertion, that you really do need to check in with your GP and have a thorough checkup for things like heart disease, angina, heart failure, respiratory conditions, and even things like anemia can be causes of shortness of breath in that way.
Right. So Joe is a 27-year-old, young, healthy, normal weight, fit male who does a lot of exercise, weightlifting, and
a male,
and jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. So again, I think the first point of call would still be checking in with your GP, even though it would be less common to have heart conditions in that age group, things like anemia possibilities and even unusual causes of heart conditions can occur in that age group. And, so I still think that would be the best course of action. I wouldn't look directly at the diet in terms of addressing that symptom.
Okay, thank you. So I've got another question. There are varied opinions on the impact of a low-carb diet on lipid profiles.
Mm-hmm.
How does this dietary approach influence factors like LDL cholesterol and triglycerides? And what should clinicians be mindful of when monitoring these parameters in patients?
Sure.
How can patients effectively educate healthcare professionals to embrace a low-carb lifestyle approach, especially when it may differ from conventional medical advice?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions there. I guess, first of all, from a lipid point of view, it's important to recognise that what is atherogenic dyslipidemia, which means what type of lipid abnormalities actually contribute or are found associated most strongly with atherosclerosis, and it's having high triglycerides, having low levels of HDL cholesterol, and having increased amounts of small, dense LDL cholesterol. And total cholesterol really doesn't have much bearing on people's risk profiles at all, which is why it's not part of risk calculators, as LDL is not part of risk calculators. They actually usually use a ratio of cholesterol and HDL. So that's one important thing. And so the way a low carbohydrate diet usually affects lipid parameters is that triglycerides usually go down and HDL usually goes up. And then cholesterol can go up or down and LDL can go up or down. But because the triglycerides are going down, small dense LDL is reduced. So it's creating a more favorable lipid profile. And then with respect to how to educate the doctor, I would suggest that most doctors are not trained in that way of interpreting lipid profiles, nor have they learned about low carbohydrate diet. So you could perhaps recommend that they check out my website, lowcarbscripts.com, which has got some easy courses for GPs to learn about. Otherwise, I would probably suggest that you keep your normal GP, but you may be able to find another health practitioner who is knowledgeable about these diets and knowledgeable about the effects on lipid profiles, because they'll be able to help you a little bit more with that lipid profile. So you don't need to give up your GP at all, but you're probably not going to have a whole lot of success, I think, in educating them about it. Some doctors, particularly cardiologists, are very fixed in their mindset, and it's very pharmaceutical company influenced as well. And so I think that it won't, I don't know, I think if you gave them a journal article or something like that, they probably wouldn't read it, I would think, for a lot of doctors.
Right. Okay. And do you just want to quickly explain what small dense LDL is? Because a lot of people have probably never heard of small dense LDL.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. So basically, the way that the lipoproteins work, and they are just simply molecules that go around the body, and they're made up partly out of fat, which is lipid, and partly out of protein. And they basically carry a lot of other substances the body needs around the body, including cholesterol, including triglycerides for energy, and including antioxidants and things like that that are needed for repair of cells. And each of those components are needed by every cell because they're part of every cell. So cholesterol makes up cell membranes, for instance. It makes up all your steroid hormones, etc. And so the body has got this very carefully orchestrated system where the liver makes something called very low density lipoprotein, or VLDL, which progressively becomes smaller and smaller by dropping off some of its cargo, and it becomes intermediate density lipoprotein and then low density lipoprotein. And that's the normal healthy system. And then the low density lipoprotein, which is the LDL, will get returned to the liver and then it'll get recycled. But what happens when the physiology is abnormal is that the LDL cholesterol will float around in the system trying to offload its cargo, or it's being damaged by other systems such as like sugar is a big one, for instance, that will damage the LDL. And so damaged LDL is what we call small dense LDL. It's smaller than normal. And then the liver doesn't want it at all. And so the only way for the small dense LDL to get picked up, instead of returning to the liver, it gets picked up by the arteries, and they have got what are called foam cells in the arteries, which are basically like the garbage trucks of the system, and they're happy to take up the small dense LDL, and then the small dense LDL contributes to plaque in that way. So healthy LDL is not harmful, it's essential to life, and it's the small dense LDL which is associated with atherosclerosis risk.
And so the prime indicator of that small dense LDL is when you have very high triglycerides. Yes,
that's right. If you're, I'm not sure what your units of measure are in New Zealand, but in Australia we use millimoles per litre. So triglycerides, if your triglycerides are above 1, and then you're likely to have some small dense LDL of increasing amounts depending on how high your triglycerides get. And men should have a HDL level above 1, and women should have a HDL level of at least 1.3. So there's slightly different sex variant in terms of the levels that you need, but basically you want your triglyceride levels to be low.
Yeah, that's great. All right, there is a couple of other questions. There's a question about avocados.
Okay.
That gone. Hang on, I'm sort of scrolling through the questions and I don't want to miss any. What effect do avocados have on a low-carb diet?
Sure. So avocados are a very natural food. There's one ingredient in an avocado, and they are high in a type of fat called monosaturated fats. And monosaturated fats and also saturated fats are very healthy, sort of natural fats for the body. So avocados generally, because they're high in fat, if you ate an excessive amount of avocado, you could still gain weight. I've definitely seen patients who've gained weight just because they were eating large amounts of avocado. However, the type of fat in avocado is a type of fat that's regarded as healthy for the body. Yeah.
Right. So with low-carb diets, if you're not getting your energy from carbohydrates, you have to get your energy from somewhere. And so that's why they tend to be higher in fats relative to the carbohydrates, which is a bit different than what we were used to, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And I usually get patients to particularly focus on getting enough protein in, and then it's fat for flavor and fat to feel full. And I find that that's more generally accepted to health practitioners as well, because then you're just cutting out the carbs or dropping down the carbs.
Right. So there's a couple more questions. For patients with diabetes, how does a low-carb diet contribute to glycemic control? And what adjustments might be necessary in their medication management and monitoring? Sure. Again, bearing in mind you're not giving personal medical advice.
Yeah, this is general advice. So basically, there are 3 macronutrients. There's carbohydrates, there's protein, and there's fat. And the body needs protein and fat because your body is made up out of protein and fat. There's no actual essential level of carbohydrate required because your liver is capable of making all the carbohydrate that you need. You only need 1 teaspoon of glucose in the blood at any one time, and your liver's perfectly capable of making that. So that means that we all know that, or a lot of us know that, most of us know what carbs are because they're the bottom part of the food pyramid we've been told to eat the most of. And the complex carbs are basically, so things like bread, pasta, rice, potato, they're all just chains of sugar joined together. And the body breaks those down into single units of glucose that then get used by the body for energy. So we know that carbohydrates have got the biggest effect on people's blood sugar level. It makes their blood sugar levels spike the most. So by dropping down the carbohydrates, you have less spikes in your blood sugar level, which is going to be very helpful if you're someone who has got diabetes and you're carbohydrate intolerant, because you have big spikes in your blood sugar level. So that's the main effect that carbs have. And the influence of dropping carbs for people with diabetes is that you see enormous beneficial changes in their blood sugar levels within days. So their blood sugars will come right down, and then you can measure their HbA1c after 3 months, and you usually will see big drops in that HbA1c level. And in terms of the medication changes that are normally made, generally insulin is usually halved on day 1. And that's important to definitely do in consultation with your healthcare provider and with very careful monitoring of sugars as that gets tapered. The sulfonylureas are usually stopped because they are associated with low blood sugar levels. And if people have really dropped down their carbohydrates, and generally any blood pressure medications often need tapering because people's blood pressure improves and they can get low blood pressure. And there's another class of drug called the SGLT2 inhibitors. In Australia, we also call them flozins because that's the last part of their name. So it might be empagliflozin as an example. And these are associated with a rare risk called euglycemic ketoacidosis. Yes, I said that right the first time. And basically, people can have blood sugars in not too high a range, but can have acidic blood. Their ketones can go up. So they're really the main adjustments that are made. Over time, people may sometimes come off their reflux medication because they're no longer getting reflux. Some people may have improvements in their mood and may come off their antidepressants. But for people with diabetes, they're the main tweaks that need to be made. So there's really only 4. There's insulin, sulfonylureas, SGLT2 inhibitors, and high blood pressure medications.
Thank you. Right, there's a question here, not looking for medical advice here, but generally speaking, please can you share how high blood urea nitrogen and higher urea is relevant to protein intake?
Yeah, so it is a little bit complicated. I'll start with the simple aspect of it. So basically, your body will take in protein, which gets broken down into the building blocks amino acids. And for some of the processes in the body actually has to remove what's called amine groups off those amino acids in order to process it. So the body has this way of dealing with nutrients, and it can convert them into glucose, or it can convert them into ketones, or can store them as fat. But with protein, it can't store protein in its actual form. So there's only a limit to how much your body needs, and there's a limit of how much it can handle at once. And for most people, it's way, way higher than any of the recommended daily intake levels. So for most people don't eat enough protein. But it's the body's way of processing things that leads to urea. And so what you typically see in patients prior to starting a low-carb diet, if they are metabolically unhealthy, is a lot of them will have high urate levels, which is another byproduct of that process. And so when they go on a low-carb diet, the urate levels, which can also be associated with gout, come down typically. And so there is a protein threshold that people can have. So that's why people who are following a carnivore diet, for instance, are recommended to have fatty cuts of meat, because if they're only eating lean cuts of meat, they're only getting amino acids and protein, and their body can only handle a certain amount of that. So the other things that can contribute to some other parameters on the blood test really reflect how much muscle mass the person has on board. If it's a very little old lady with hardly any muscle, she can have certain other lower levels. So it is a bit complicated, and but the main thing is, I think, have a lot of protein, but don't have too much protein, and don't eat only lean protein.
Great. And I saw a research paper by Dr. Phillips the other day, which was kind of recommending in general about 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, to me, that's a fairly, that's a pretty good moderate level of protein. I don't know what you think. Older people kind of need more, but then they have this sort of resistance to be able to digest and absorb protein as well. So, it gets quite complex. Yeah.
So like the recommended daily intake as a minimum is 0.8 milligrams per kilo of lean body mass. And that's really the minimum that you need to avoid a lot of ill health. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good amount to have if you want to be healthy. So I would normally go by 1.2 to 1.6 up to 2 milligrams per kilo of lean body mass. And so if someone was 100 kilos, they don't have 100 kilos of lean body mass typically, but what their ideal body weight would be. So if they're meant to be, if they're in their healthy weight range, say if their weight then was 70 kilos, then you could calculate it on the 70 kilo weight. So, but to eat that amount of protein, you have to eat a lot. So, and if you're having, say, something like 100 grams of steak, like it was raw steak before you cooked it, it's only sort of about 20 to 25% protein, depending on the cut and depending on how much fat and bone is in it, etc. So just because you're having 100 grams of steak, you're probably only having about 20, 25 grams of protein with that. And so if you're trying to get, say, 80 grams, I would try to get maybe 80 grams of protein myself, then I would need to have a good palmful of protein at each meal. And so at breakfast, that would be 3 eggs. And if you're fasting, if you're only having 1 meal a day, that's going to be pretty hard for you to get your protein requirements in. And there's also some evidence to say that there's a limit to how much protein your body can use at any one meal. And it might be something along the lines of 40 grams. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, protein is it's simple, but it's complicated, you know.
I think that's why I think a palmful of protein each meal is really just a sensible, easy way to look at it. And there's so many of us who do not have that amount. But if you are feeling hungry, upping your protein often really makes you feel more satisfied and helps to preserve your lean body mass when you're trying to lose weight.
I think it's really important to remember that 100 grams of, like you said, 100 grams of the steak isn't 100 grams of protein. It's going to give 25 grams of protein. You know, we usually look at about 120 grams per meal to get your 30 grams of protein.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. What effect does a low carb diet have on autoimmune disease?
Yeah, so look, I have definitely seen patients who have had autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis being an example, who have really improved in their pain and their inflammatory markers quite soon after starting on a low carbohydrate diet. So I think that generally autoimmune conditions can improve on a low carb diet, but diet's only one factor that affects autoimmune conditions. So the other things that are really big is sleep and stress, and then, you know, diet. And some people definitely still need some medication, like gut health is very important with autoimmunity as well. So I think that the diet's a great place to start. It cuts out a lot of things that might be potentially irritant and toxic to the body and might inflame the body. But other things like lack of sleep and high stress continue to also inflame the body. So you've got to really take a very holistic view of autoimmune disease.
And what about thyroid disease? Because that's something that comes up a lot in low carb. It's thyroid dysfunction. So if you're on a low carb or carnivore diet, are your thyroid tests, you know, are those laboratory values, are they as relevant when you're on that kind of diet as they are? That's a question I've seen come up. And then, you know, what's the impact if you had thyroid function prior to starting a low carb diet? What would you expect to see? Yeah,
so I guess thyroid, thyroid hormone is used a lot to process carbohydrates. So when you're on less carbohydrates, you may need less thyroid hormone. And so people who lose weight or go on a low carb diet, their thyroid levels can come down actually. But at the same time, a lot of thyroid dysfunction is caused by autoimmune disease. And so those other factors like the stress, etc., can still be playing a part. And if they're autoimmune, like antibodies, for instance, say if they're really high and they're attacking the thyroid gland still, you can be chasing a little bit of a moving target because the gland function keeps changing each time. So I still personally do monitor people's thyroid levels if they've got that history, and I would generally aim for people to be within the reference range, understanding that there's some people who might feel better outside of the reference range for whatever reason. Yeah.
And do you just monitor TSH, or do you monitor antibodies and, you know, free T4 and free T3? And
yeah. So in Australia, we are allowed to order a TSH, which is the hormone that comes from the brain that stimulates the thyroid gland, and we monitor its activity to get a gauge of how much thyroid hormone is being produced. And if the TSH level is abnormal, then in Australia, they will do a T4 level. I am starting to see T3 being reported a little bit more, but it's mainly T4 and TSH that gets done in Australia. And then thyroid antibodies, I would tend to test more in pregnancy because they're relevant there, because if someone's even got a very minor degree of thyroid dysfunction in pregnancy, it's usually managed pretty aggressively in some ways, because we want the baby to have a normal thyroid level for normal brain development. So testing thyroid hormone is part of the protocol that you follow if you're managing a pregnant lady, at least initially, to see whether you should initiate thyroid hormone with the patient. And otherwise, I might measure them, say, once, but I don't otherwise track and measure thyroid hormone levels. I mean, thyroid antibody levels myself. I think it gives you some clues to the diagnosis, whether it's Hashimoto's or Graves' disease. Normally, the levels still get monitored. Yeah.
Right. Should I calorie count when on a low-carb diet?
Sure. I guess it depends on the reason why you're on a low-carb diet. I personally think that initially, well, I guess depending on, if you're trying to lose weight, and I think this does depend in part whether you're a female or not, because females generally don't lose weight as fast and as easily as men on a low carbohydrate diet. And I think that's a factor of that they have dieted a lot before often, and their hormone situation is different, and they may be going through menopause or other fluctuations in their cycle, etc. And they're often under different stresses as well, I think. So, however, with respect to calories, like, you can't just eat endless amounts of anything. Your body still does store excesses as fat. And so if you are having more calories in the body than what your body actually does need, then it will turn those extra calories into fat. And you're not going to be able to tap into your own fat stores and lose weight if you keep eating lots of calories. But by keeping your carb calories low, it affects your hormone levels such that your insulin levels go down, and you can actually tap into your fat stores, and you're using your own fat stores to contribute some of the energy and some of the fat requirements for your body. So I think I don't actually recommend patients to count carbs to count calories. And actually, I don't even recommend patients count carbs. Most of the time, they're just following a list and getting an idea of what to do. However, if someone is having trouble losing weight or have plateaued, then it can be really helpful to track things for a while and see if there's any carb creep or perhaps extra calories that are coming in. And that's why I think that most people do not need to add lots of added fats to things. If you're having a fatty cut of meat, you don't need to pour cream over everything, because you want your own fat to supply some of the fat on the diet.
And I'm just going to emphasize that protein doesn't really count. It doesn't really get converted into fat the same way that carbohydrates do, and fat actually does. It's very different. It's hard to overeat protein. So you're talking about energy coming from carbs and from fat.
Yeah, I mean, even so, like, as I said before, with protein, you can't actually store protein. Your body just cannot store it. And so if you're having more that than what your body can use initially to build new enzymes and proteins and muscles and things that you need, then it's got a pathway of being turned into glucose or into ketones. But eventually it can also be turned into fat. If if you were just eating, it'd be very hard to do, but if you were eating and overeating and eating past satiety, then it would be possible, I think, to gain weight eating any of the macronutrients. Yeah.
Okay. All right. If you're dairy intolerant, what's the best milk and other things to have on a low carb diet?
Yes. So I guess I guess people don't need to have milk, but if they like to have some sort of milk, the most important thing is to read the ingredient panel on the milk and to really look for sweeteners and sugars that are added, and also particularly vegetable oils that are added. They often have like a canola oil or a sunflower oil or something like that added to it. So you just really want to read the different labels, and as long as it didn't have a vegetable oil added or a sweetener or a sugar, then I would be okay with people having different milks, be it almond milk or nut milk, or I would probably advise not having oat milk. But yeah, they're the main things that you want to look for on the label, and it's really actually quite hard to find a milk like that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was looking at questions. How can a low-carb diet be structured to ensure individuals still meet their nutritional needs? So I guess this question is kind of relating to reducing carbohydrates and the this idea that we have, they're full of vitamins and minerals and nutrients that we need. So if we're cutting them out, how are we going to fulfill those needs?
So I guess with carbohydrates, when they measure the nutrients in it, because essentially carbohydrates provide glucose, they are sometimes fortified with things like folic acid, or even fiber has been added to them, for example. So in itself, your body just doesn't need the carbohydrates. And humans evolved eating meat and prey, and maybe a little bit of vegetables or things that they found, or a little bit of berries and things like this. Agriculture with farming and developing, wheat and growing those sorts of things and developing products from it has only been in civilization for about 10,000 years. So for all the millions of years before that, humans just ate what they found. So your body is designed to actually not eat carbs, actually. So it's just that the nutritional guidelines have evolved to recommend that people have, 45% of their diet at least coming from carbohydrates. And that's not a guideline that is all over the world. That is sort of Western countries have that sort of guideline, but there's plenty of countries that don't eat so many carbohydrates. So I think the main key thing is that you want to eat natural foods. So you want to eat food that has got single ingredients. So, chicken or meat or a certain type of vegetable or a certain type of berry or dairy or whatever it is. And if you do that, your food will be much more nutritious than anything that you buy out of a packet, because the processing removes so much nutrients from the food that we eat. And even if someone is following and I'm not a carnivore, I'm an omnivore, but people who follow a carnivore diet, if they're following it correctly, and that would be eating tip to tail and having a variety of cuts of meat and, having some bone broth and some fat and different things like this, then they can acquire all the nutrients that need, because meat is such a highly dense product in terms of its nutrient concentration. And if they're eating the offcuts of meat, also known as offal, then those cuts contain a lot of different vitamins that the body needs. And then your body has got different needs for vitamins depending on the diet that you eat. So if you're eating much less carbohydrates, you don't need, for instance, as much vitamin C, because vitamin C is used to also metabolize carbohydrates. So that's why vitamin intake isn't as simple as everyone should be on the same thing. Everyone's body is different and the types of food they eat are different, but it would be much easier to have a nutrient replete diet, eating a whole food, low carb diet, than it would by eating a supermarket diet.
Right. And I think, for a lot of people who think that these fruits and vegetables are absolutely chocker full of vitamins for us, a lot of them are in forms that take a lot for our body to process and convert into the usable form, so like, beta carotene getting converted into retinol, for example. You have to eat a lot of carrots to make that conversion.
Yeah. Yeah, and food, we do eat food. It's not like we eat single vitamins. All food is a combination of different things, and it has an interaction with your gut and your gut biome, which is very involved in extracting nutrients from food as well. So, yeah, like it's yeah. If people, I just think if you just eat natural food, that's what your body is designed to do, and it'll work it out.
Can a vegetarian depend entirely on vegan protein powders or whey for all their protein requirements?
Yes, I think if you are following a vegan diet, the only way to have a nutrient replete diet is to supplement, and that would be things like B12 as an example, and certainly with protein. And in terms of with fat, if you're not having any source of animal fat, then the healthy fats on a vegan diet would come from things like avocado, like the monounsaturated fats, like seeds and nuts and things like that, coconut milk, coconut oil. So it could become a little bit more boring because of that lack of variety. But if you do need to use protein, then I think, yep, a protein powder isolate is something to consider adding in, or a hemp powder. Like tempeh and natto are other sources of protein as well that you can use. But when you're looking at a protein powder supplement, you again just read the ingredient list. And if something has got more than 5 ingredients in it, and this would apply to pretty much all foods, it is likely to be an ultra processed food. So you want to have as few ingredients as possible, and you don't want to have fillers and carbs and additives that you don't understand in it. You're looking for something that's pretty much a whey protein isolate, or something with a similar amount of ingredients as that.
Thanks for bringing that up, because I missed a question earlier on, which was about the quality and purity of whey protein isolate that's generally available in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Whey, are the regulatory authorities vigilant, and can we assume that these powders sold in New Zealand are by and large good quality and they don't contain heavy metals or other impurities? I know that a lot of protein powders are imported anyway, so
yeah, I just think we can't assume much from the food labeling that happens on most food, and even if when something has got a protein amount listed on the label, it actually reflects the nitrogen content of that food. So it's actually an estimated protein amount. It's not, you can't guarantee that all the protein content on that product is actually listed under protein is actually protein. It's actually based on a calculation based on how much nitrogen is in that food. So it's tricky even with something as simple as that. So then you just have to do your own research, and maybe research the companies a little bit just to see their reputation a little bit. I certainly don't know much with respect to heavy metals and stuff like that being added to things, but I guess it's possible. Yeah.
Can you discuss in general terms how a low carb diet may affect inflammation?
Oh, yes, sure. So I guess with inflammation in the body is good if it's short-lived and directed at a specific purpose, and it helps your body to bring in some defense systems and to heal. For instance, if you had a tonsillitis, you can get a lot of inflammation and a big elevation in a marker called CRP, which is your C-reactive protein, because your body's really trying to fight off this infection. But if inflammation is sustained and ongoing and unchecked, then that would form more what we see in chronic disease. And when someone is overweight, their fat cells, it's not that they develop more fat cells. Their fat cells don't actually multiply in number. The fat cells just get overstuffed. And when they get overstuffed, they outgrow the blood supply and they become stressed, and they release a lot of chemicals into the body to talk to other parts of the body And these are chemicals such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor, which are these, inflammatory chemicals. And then they go to the liver and they talk to the liver, and the liver makes something called CRP, which causes inflammation. So if someone does lose weight and their fat cells, particularly, the fat cells around their organs and around their middle, come down in size, and there's just less inflammation around. And so generally on a low carb diet, inflammation will come down, and that would be a beneficial thing. Mm.
Right. What amount of carbs should we have to lose weight?
Oh, okay, sure. So this is actually quite an individual thing. So if you're on under 50 grams of carbs per day, we would say generally that would be a ketogenic diet, that's or a very low carbohydrate diet, so that your body will be able to generate ketones usually at that level. But anything under 130 grams of carbs per day would be called a low carbohydrate diet. And a paleo diet would have about 80 grams of carbs per day. So some people will need to stick to 20 or 30 grams of carbs per day to keep their diabetes under control, or to lose weight if they're very insulin resistant and carb intolerant. But someone else might be able to be on 60 grams a day or 70 grams a day and be fine. So I think it's good to start off. Usually with the list I give people, it's usually, if they stick to it, they'd be generally under 50 grams of carbs per day. And if they're not getting results with that, then I would get them to make sure they're not having too many nuts or too much fat added to the diet. Look at exercise, look at sleep, look at stress, look at alcohol, look at sweeteners. They're often the other factors that can make people hold on to weight as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you recommend low carb diets to all of your patients, or just ones with particular health issues?
Yes, so I tend to recommend it to patients with particular health issues, or if a patient has come to me with, requesting specific help in that area. And I certainly do look out for any sort of features of metabolic dysfunction on blood tests or on measurements like waist measurement or blood pressure, etc. And I'll raise it with a lot of people that I would recommend that you benefit from a low carbohydrate diet or fasting. And if you're interested, come back and see me again. But I think that there are some rare, 90-year-olds who can eat as many carbs as they want and still be slim and active, but there's not very many. Usually for most people, there comes a time, in your 40s, or it might be your 50s, might even be your 20s, where you start to gain weight around the middle. And I think that those people can definitely benefit from a low carb diet, or their blood sugar's going up, or their lipids are going out. So, yeah.
What role does salt have on a low carb diet?
Yeah, so a low carbohydrate diet makes you pee out more salt, and this is because high insulin levels make you retain salt, and when your insulin levels go down, you pee out a lot more salt via the kidneys and the urine. And so if you don't replace that salt, you'll become salt deficient, and you'll develop what we call keto flu, which is feeling lethargic or headachy, perhaps getting constipated, tired, those sorts of symptoms, particularly when initiating a low carb diet. And it's easily fixed by people just making sure that they add 1 to 2 teaspoons of salt to their food each day. And some people don't need quite that much. And a lot of food already has salt in it. So bacon and cheese, for instance, has got salt in it. Vegemite has got salt in it. So, but I always tell patients that if they are feeling any of those symptoms, to think of salt first. Have some salt, have a spoon of Vegemite, have a stock cube and some hot water, have a sprinkle of salt in your hand. And if you feel a lot better in 10 minutes, you need to up your salt again in future. Yeah.
Hey, how are you going there, Louise? There's still a few questions here to get through.
Yeah, it's all good. I appreciate that people have hung around after I was so late with coming.
They've done really well, and it's wonderful that they've all stuck around.
Yeah, it is great.
How many grams protein, fats, and carbs per day would be ideal for a person who is on a 2,350 calorie low carb diet? It's quite an exact number, isn't it?
That's a bit hard to do. So I guess what I would do is that I would recommend that you calculate your protein requirement first and say go by maybe 1.5 milligrams. Oh, sorry, 1.5
grams.
Grams per kilo. Sorry, grams per kilo of what your lean body weight would be, and then to put that in, and then to add some, if you want to have vegetables and whatnot, add some of that in, and then add some fat for flavor, and try to keep the carbs really low. So, and if you want to, there's some nice tables on Diet Doctor which help you calculate your protein requirement and list out for you what your, based on your height, how much protein you're likely to need and what that looks like on a plate. So yeah, I mean, you can use apps like Chronometer and Carb Manager as well to calculate things out, but that's the way that I would do it for patients. And as I said, I don't normally get my patients to track these sorts of macros. I keep it pretty simple. Yeah. Mm.
And I guess, I mean, that's a fairly exact number of calories. So I guess it would depend whether it's a man and a woman, their age, and how much exercise you're doing as well. So there'd be quite a few other factors in there. So you want to work out your protein. I guess you figure out how many grams of carbs, what kind of low carb diet you want to go on. And then you just play with your fat to make sure that you stayed within.
Yeah. So I think once you've got your protein right, if you want to set your carb limit at 50 grams and see how that goes, and then if you're not losing weight, we'll drop it down to 40 grams and see how that goes, and maybe to 30. So you'll find a level that it might start happening for you again. Keeping in mind those other factors of sleep and stress, they're pretty key things. Yeah. And sleep apnea is something that is often unrecognized. Mm.
Yeah. Right. There was another question. Can you supply Sue with your list for a low carb diet? She can share it with us later. I don't know.
I don't do that specifically. Mainly because I've got a product that I sell to doctors called the Low Carb Doctors Kit, and so that contains all the handouts that I use. It contains all the patient images I use, as well as the way I explain it to patients and a patient demonstration and stuff like that. So because it's part of a paid kit, and they're all 30% off at the moment with a coupon code Happy Holidays, but I don't sort of release those particular ones because of that reason. Yeah.
I think you can, I mean, I can give you some low carb food guides, and I think you can find lots of them online.
There's heaps of them around. Exactly. Yeah.
So, and I'm happy to share some low carb guidelines with everybody. Right. What role do fermented foods play in a low carb diet, considering their potential benefits for gut health? Are there specific fermented foods that align well with a low carb approach, and how might they positively impact the microbiome? That is kefir, kombucha, etc.
So I think that fermented foods can add, health to your gut biome and increase the diversity of your gut biome. And essentially, everyone's got about 2 kilos of gut bacteria that line their intestine, anywhere from their mouth all the way down to their bottom. And it performs different functions all the way through. And so you want to have healthy, functional gut bacteria. And so fermented foods can add to that. And I think you just want to make sure that, again, they don't have added sugars and other extra ingredients that aren't so healthy. Fermented foods that you make yourself or that are made in a traditional way would be more beneficial. And the other way of having a healthy gut biome is really to eat the whole foods, because we call those prebiotics. So they feed the gut bacteria and will grow up the populations of gut bacteria that like eating those foods, which are generally more beneficial for the body. And avoiding, antibiotics are very necessary things at times and life-saving, etc. But some people might take them unnecessarily as well, and that will have a detrimental effect on the gut biome. And the other thing is artificial sweeteners. So these are things, particularly things like aspartate and things like that, that are in a lot of foods. They may be in toothpaste, for example, and you may not know, or in frozen food it's been added. And so you can be ingesting a lot of sweeteners, and sweeteners can knock out some of the healthy gut bacteria and can grow up the type of gut bacteria that are capable of extracting every last calorie from the food that you eat, so they can make you fatter. And so I think avoiding artificial sweeteners is an important thing. There's 3 sweeteners on a keto diet that are generally permitted, and they would be monk fruit, stevia, and erythritol. And that's because they also don't spike insulin levels in the same way that even aspartate can cause a spike in insulin levels from a brain response. So, and even those sweeteners, can promote, they can foster addiction and craving for some people. And there were some particular issues with the erythritol, which were raised earlier this year. So, there can be good stepping stones for some people, but I think from a gut bacteria point of view, it's important to avoid particularly the most of the sweeteners that are found in most food.
Great. What's the role of fiber? Should we be worried about this on a low carb diet?
Yeah, so I think some people feel like, a low carb diet's low in fiber, but just because you're not having Weet-Bix or wholemeal bread, you still can have plenty of fiber from the vegetables that you're eating. There's plenty of variety that you can have. It's just the below ground vegetables that you can't have. And although there's a lot of fruit that you can't have, you can get lots of nutrients from the vegetables and stuff. And fiber has got mixed effects on the gut. So fiber is basically a type of carbohydrate that is not digestible by the body, and it passes down into the large intestine, where it can then be fermented by bacteria, and this can create bloating and gas. So there was a great study by a gastroenterology group who had a number of patients, I can't quite remember how many it was, say 16 or something like that, and they first excluded bowel cancer and things like that by doing a colonoscopy, and then they actually had them remove fiber from their diet, go on a very low fiber diet, and 100% of them resolved their symptoms of bloating and gas and abdominal discomfort that they were having chronically for years. And then they allowed the patients to choose, after a couple of weeks, to choose whether they wanted to continue on that diet or whether they wanted to reintroduce the high fiber. And the 6 patients that reintroduced the high fiber, just because they thought it felt, it was the best thing to do, etc., they all had symptoms return, whereas the people who stayed on the low fiber diet felt way better. And this is because if you're trying to evacuate feces through a very small anal sphincter, if it's big and bulky, it's going to be harder for that to happen, as well as the fact that you can generate gas and bloating from the fermentation. So I guess that means that, one, fiber is not good for everyone. Some people feel better off fiber. And 2, that you can still have lots of fiber on a low carbohydrate diet. And so, so I think that's where fiber can be a little bit misunderstood. And, carnivores, for instance, don't have any fiber in their diet, and, most of them, their bowels seem to improve.
Yeah. And if you want to learn more about fiber, there's a book written by Konstantin Monastyrsky. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's called Fiber Menace. I did do a podcast with him. Very interesting guy. Oh gosh, you have to go through accepting all these cookies and things. Fiber minus. I'll just copy the link. No, is it going to let me copy it? Yeah, I'll pop that into the chat if anybody wants to follow up with that. What am I doing? Chat. There we go. Chat to meeting group chat. Hope that link works. Okay. Right, where's the rest of the chat going? There we go. Is thaumatin sweetness safe? THAUMATIN.
I'm not familiar with that one, but so I would say, I would think not. So the main sweetener that's come out that is apparently keto is allulose. However, I don't know if we have that really in Australia either. So I think with any sort of new sort of sweeteners, it's important to just be a little bit wary with them. So with erythritol, which I mentioned before, it has been found that people who consumed more of that had an increased risk of stroke and heart attack, and that's because it seems to increase clotting in the blood. And so they've done some studies on some carotid arteries in mice, and they've done these observational studies in humans. And what they've found as well is that humans who had a can of soft drink with a certain amount of erythritol in it, which is a very standard sort of amount that you would get from a standard can of soft drink that was sweetened with that it just stays in your blood system for like 4 days or something. And for at least a couple of days, it stays in your system at a level that could possibly trigger clotting. And so that certainly makes me more wary of using erythritol. It is observational study, and as well as some I suppose animal studies and stuff like that. But you know, we don't really know what these chemicals do to our body. We never used to eat them.
So I just looked it up because I didn't know what it was. So it comes from the tempeh plant. I don't know that I'm pronouncing that properly, from Western Africa. And it's called a completely natural sweetener. And it claims that it doesn't spike your blood sugar, it's suitable for diabetics, low calories, blends well, won't harm your teeth, 100% safe. So, I mean, that's what the...
Sounds 100% safe. Yeah. I think as well, like, you want to make sure it doesn't spike your insulin levels.
Yeah,
that's the thing with the non-nutritive sweeteners, like stevia, and that they don't spike your insulin levels, whereas something like xylitol still does a half spike of your insulin levels.
So they're claiming that it doesn't change the gut microbiome, and so anyway, that's the marketing material on the internet.
Yeah.
Okay, lots of vegan powders in New Zealand contain it. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think you're trying to, I guess, balance multiple different factors, and there's a lot that we don't know, right? There's even in, you know, keto diets have been studied, the most studied diet around. There's still a lot that is probably unknown, and so I think you need protein if you're anyone, but if you're vegan, then you probably need it to take it from some sort of artificial source, and then you just want to make sure that you minimize the extra ingredients.
Yeah, because the trouble with trying to get protein from plant sources is the number of calories you have to eat, and they're all carbohydrate calories. So
yeah,
like quinoa and even tofu, you have to eat a lot of it to be able to reach your protein intake.
Right.
I don't think I asked you this question. In your experience, how important is it to personalize a low carb approach for individuals?
Oh, I think it's 100% important. So because we're all individuals and we all live different lives. You know, I might have 2 children who are late teenagers. However, a lot of people might have little babies that they're looking after. So everyone's got different demands on their system, and ultimately you need to have a way of eating that you can maintain in the long term if you're wanting to do it for health benefits. And that definitely takes an individualized approach.
And then low carb diets may be challenging to sustain over the long term. What strategies or recommendations do you recommend to patients?
Yeah, I think maintaining any diet is it can be hard to maintain in the long term. I think knowing your why, like why are you doing this? Is it to maintain your weight? Is it to avoid diabetes? Is it so that when you're retired that you can live a healthy, active life that you've envisaged? And being sure of your why helps you stay motivated to stay on a diet. Some people are able to deviate from the diet in small ways and get back on the diet pretty easily, and other people might have food addictions and cannot get back on the diet easily. And so for those people, I think strictly adhering is the best way of staying on the diet. Otherwise, I think knowing how to navigate things like Christmas and holidays. And so on my website there is a downloadable handout that you're welcome to get, which is called like how to stay low carb during the holidays. And then there's another one as well that's available at the moment for people who are Asian or South Asian descent who would like to follow a low carb diet, and some strategies that they would like to use. So I think that knowing how to deal with family situations and functions and parties, all these things that we live in, because you don't just live in your own house dealing with things. You've got to go out into the real world knowing what to say to people. And I think having a health practitioner who can interpret the blood results and, if not support you, to at least not deter you from following this sort of intervention, if that's what you want to do, is all of those things I think are important.
Excellent. All right. Are there any last questions? If I've missed anything from anybody, please let me know. I've probably jumped around a little bit, but hopefully I've covered everybody's questions. So if you've got any last questions, please pop them in the chat. And Louise, I'll make sure that I share your website and all
those, okay, cool.
All those details when we send out the recording. And you have a couple more questions. Would you consult online for someone living overseas?
Unfortunately, medico-legally, under my indemnity policy, I'm not allowed to provide advice to even my own patients who, travel overseas and things like that. They have to be residing in Australia for me to be covered insurance-wise. But if you've, I don't know, do you guys have a database over there, Sue? Like in Australia, we've got the Low Carb Down Under, which has got a database.
I think we've got a couple of GPs who are now working sort of outside of their medical practice, who are doing tele consults. So there'll be some limited liabilities and things around that because about providing medical advice. But I'll share that in the show notes as well. Right. One more question. How do seed oils differ from other fats such as saturated fats or monounsaturated fats concerning their effects on health outcomes? Yeah,
sure. So basically with fats, if the fats are just like molecules all joined together in a nice straight line, that's what we'd call a saturated fat. There's no double bond inside them. In a monounsaturated fat, there's one double bond that is there, and that kinks the molecule, and that means that the fat doesn't lie nice and flat and straight like you get in a steak, a very solid sort of fat, which is a saturated fat. Instead, you have a fat that's more fluid, and that's what you have in olives and avocado, types of monounsaturated fats. And then a polyunsaturated fat has got lots of double bonds within the molecule, and that really kinks the molecule. And that means that it's very viscous, and even when you put it in the fridge, it stays liquid. And that's what vegetable oils or seed oils are. And the problem is that each of those double bonds is unstable. It can break down, and that will generate what we call free radicals. And free radicals are types of molecules that are unstable, and they're missing an electron in their outer shell. And instead, they try to reach out and grab an electron from another molecule to try to stabilize themselves, but then they damage that other cell. And so the polyunsaturated fats are basically unstable. They create free radicals that then create damage, and they're inflammatory, and they're very modern invention. Humans have always eaten the saturated fats and the monounsaturated fats. So for patients, I tell them to, the healthy fats are the ones you can explain in a sentence how you made it. How was butter made? How did you get the fat off the chicken? Everyone can explain those sorts of things, but you ask someone to explain how they make a vegetable oil, and no one understands the multiple chemical processes involved in that. And then within the polyunsaturated fat group, there are a couple of groups, and then these are called the essential fatty acids. So these are the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids. So these are polyunsaturated fatty acids, but these are essential ones. We need these ones for our body, and you can get them from things like fatty fish. So, mackerel, salmon, those sorts of things for the omega-3s, and the omega-6s you can get from seeds and nuts and things like that. So even though they're a type of polyunsaturated fat, they're an essential type. So that's basically...
You get both of them from all your animal products. So all your meat.
You can actually. That's absolutely true. And it depends on, they're a little bit complicated, but what the animals eat depends on what their ratios are of that. But essentially, vegetable oils are really best avoided, and they are present in most packet food and takeaway. So reading the labels and avoiding those, I think, is a really critical thing. They're very associated with chronic disease.
Right. Last question. Lucky last. Would you recommend a few brands of tested and tried protein powders for vegan and whey?
Yeah, this is hard because I live in Australia as well, and I guess I'll just say that the whey protein isolate powder that I buy, I get from the supermarket in Australia called Coles, and I looked on the shelf, and that one had the least ingredients in it. And I've certainly had patients bring in powders, and there's so many ingredients in some of them. So I just think that I can't recommend a specific brand, that I would just recommend that you go in and just look at all the labels, and you might be there for like 10 minutes doing that. But once you've done it, you'll be able to find a brand that will fit into those parameters. Yeah.
I think gold standard is not too bad, which it's an international powder, but we can get it in New Zealand. I'm happy for you to take some photos and email them to me or something, and I'll have a look as well and see what's in them. At this point, I would recommend Ben Bickman's health code. So it's kind of more of a meal replacement than just a pure protein powder. But I recommend that for a lot of my clients. And so it's called Health Code. And if you're in New Zealand, you have to buy it through Australia. I used to be able to get some discounts for people, but I can't anymore, unfortunately. I'll just type those in for you. So, yep, gold standard. And HLTH health code. I can probably even find you the link for the health code. Just give me 1 minute. It's under Get Health Australia. Go back to Zoom. Oops. Make sure I send it to everybody. Right. Okay. I'll pop that in the chat for you. So hopefully you can find that. Sorry, I'm not big on vegan, so I don't know much about vegan protein powders. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. It's been absolutely amazing to have you. There's a whole list of thank yous and amazing, and just how useful this has been for you to come and talk to us in the comments. So I'm absolutely thrilled everybody stayed around and there was so much engagement, and you can go and have a break now because have you still got a voice after, you know, nearly an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes of not stopping talking?
Yeah, no, thanks everyone. I really appreciate your patience earlier today and for asking the questions, and it's been great to talk to you all and to you, Sue. So thanks for having me on.
Great. All right. And I'll send you a link to this when it's all out there. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.